You were reported as suspicious. Stand up and step outside. Now.
I'm a paying customer in a public restaurant I own. I'm not leaving.
Refusing a lawful order makes this disorderly conduct.
This order isn't lawful, and your body cam is recording you arresting me for eating breakfast.
The blueberry pancakes were perfect. Fluffy golden brown with just the right amount of wild Maine blueberries bursting with flavor inside. A light dusting of powdered sugar, a small pitcher of warm maple syrup on the side. For Marcus Thorne, this wasn't just breakfast. It was a ritual. Every Tuesday morning, he'd sit in this exact booth at the Morning Sun Diner, his flagship location in downtown Charlotte, and enjoy the simple perfection of his own creation. At 55, Marcus had built an empire from a single diner into a beloved chain of 9 locations across North Carolina. He was the living embodiment of the American dream, a man who had earned his success through grit, long hours, and a recipe for pancakes that was second to none. The quiet hum of the diner, the clinking of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, the sizzle from the grill was the soundtrack to his life's work. It was the last moment of peace Marcus would know that day. Before we get into the unbelievable chain of events that followed, I need you to do something. Go to the comments and tell me what your favorite comfort food is. What's that one meal that always makes you feel right with the world? And if you believe that every single person deserves respect, regardless of what they look like, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You're not going to want to miss a second of this. The bell over the door jingled, but it didn't have the friendly sound of a new customer. It was sharp, demanding. Marcus looked up from his newspaper and saw a police officer stepping inside. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with a haircut that was all sharp angles and a jaw that was set like concrete. Officer Nolan, according to the nameplate on his chest, surveyed the room with an air of authority that seemed too large for his frame. His eyes swept past the families, the college students, the elderly couple sharing a coffee, and landed directly on Marcus. Marcus, a well-dressed black man in a tailored blazer sitting alone in a booth. The officer began walking towards him, his steps deliberate, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered service weapon. Marcus folded his newspaper and placed it neatly on the table. He had seen this movie before, though usually from a distance. He felt the familiar, weary tightening in his gut, the disappointment that even after all his success, this was still a reality. "Sir," Officer Nolan said, stopping at the edge of the booth. His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Marcus looked up at the young officer, his expression calm, his hands resting in plain sight on the table. "Is there a problem, officer? We received a call about a suspicious individual matching your description who's been sitting here for a while making the staff uncomfortable." Marcus glanced over at the counter. Maria, his manager of 15 years, was staring back, her face a mask of confusion and fear. His entire staff knew him. They were like family. "Uncomfortable?" Marcus asked, his voice even. "I highly doubt that. Who exactly called? I'm not here to debate this with you, sir." Nolan said, his tone hardening. "I'm telling you to get up and come outside with me. Now." This was it. The moment of decision. Comply with an order that was baseless and insulting, or stand his ground. For Marcus Thorne, in the heart of the empire he had built with his own 2 hands, there was only one choice. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving Officer Nolan's eyes. The diner had grown quiet. The clinking and murmuring had faded, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Every eye in the place was now fixed on their booth. "With all due respect, officer," Marcus said, his voice as smooth and steady as poured concrete. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm enjoying my breakfast." A flicker of disbelief, then anger, crossed Nolan's face. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to the immediate, unquestioning obedience that his uniform typically commanded. "Sir, you're failing to comply with a lawful order. I'm not going to ask you again." "And I'm telling you the order isn't lawful," Marcus replied calmly. He wasn't just a diner owner. He was a sharp businessman who had sat in countless meetings with lawyers. He knew his rights. "You have no reasonable suspicion that I have committed a crime. Being a black man enjoying a meal in a public establishment is not a crime. Not yet, anyway." The officer's hand tightened on his weapon. "Someone reported you. That's my basis." Someone reported what specifically? What was the suspicious behavior? Was I brandishing a fork, speaking threateningly to a salt shaker? Marcus gestured around the room. "These people work for me. They've known me for years. Ask them if I'm making them uncomfortable." Maria, the manager, finally found her voice. "Officer, that's Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He owns the place. He owns all the Morning Sun diners." Nolan shot her a dismissive glance as if she were part of the problem. His focus remained entirely on Marcus. The idea that this man could be the owner was so far outside his realm of possibility that he couldn't even process it. In his mind, he had a suspicious person, and everything else was just noise and obstruction. "Sir, I don't care who you say you are," Nolan said, his voice rising. "I need you to show me some identification and step outside." "No," Marcus said. The word was quiet but absolute. "You have not provided a legal basis for this stop, so I will not be providing you with identification. You are in my place of business, disrupting my customers and harassing me without cause. In fact, you are the one trespassing here. I am the owner of this property, and I am asking you to leave." That was the spark that lit the fuse. The challenge to his authority, the complete reversal of the power dynamic, was more than Officer Nolan's pride could handle. In the back of the diner, a regular customer who had been coming to the Morning Sun since it opened, a retired history professor, discreetly raised his phone and pressed record. He knew he was witnessing something that needed to be seen. "That's it." Officer Nolan snapped his face, flushing a deep red. The pretense of professional detachment was gone, replaced by raw, unchecked anger. "You're under arrest." "Under arrest for what?" Marcus asked, his voice still betraying no emotion, though his mind was racing. He was calculating, planning. "For eating pancakes in a restaurant I own. For trespassing on my own property. For trespassing after being told to leave. And for disorderly conduct." Nolan spat out the words, pulling his handcuffs from their pouch. The metallic click echoed in the silent diner. The absurdity of the charge was staggering. Maria gasped from behind the counter. "But he can't be trespassing. I told you he owns it." Nolan ignored her completely. He was in too deep now. Backing down in front of a room full of onlookers was not an option in his playbook. He had made a decision, and he would see it through, consequences be damned. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Now." Marcus looked at the officer, then at his half-eaten plate of pancakes. He thought of the sheer injustice of it all. He had worked 60-hour weeks for 30 years, poured his life savings into his first location, treated his employees with respect, paid his taxes, and contributed to his community. He had done everything right. And yet here he was about to be handcuffed because a young officer with a chip on his shoulder couldn't fathom a black man being in a position of power. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He was a tall man, and his presence seemed to fill the space, but he made no threatening moves. He turned around, his movements deliberate, and placed his hands behind his back. He knew this was not a fight to be won here in this aisle between the booths and the counter. This fight would be won in a courtroom. The cold steel of the cuffs bit into his wrists. The click of the lock felt final. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave that washed over him. He could feel the stares of his customers, a mixture of shock, pity, and outrage. He could see the tears welling up in Maria's eyes. Through it all, he kept his head held high. As Nolan began to lead him towards the door, Marcus caught the eye of the professor in the back, still recording. Marcus gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Keep rolling," the nod said. "The world needs to see this." Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right but were completely powerless to stop what was happening? Type yes or no in the comments below. It's a feeling that's hard to forget. The walk from his booth to the front door of the diner was the longest walk of Marcus Thorne's life. Every step was a fresh wave of indignity. He passed the photos on the wall pictures of the diner's grand opening of him with the mayor at a charity event of his staff at the annual company picnic. It was a gallery of his life's achievements, and he was being paraded past it like a common criminal. The bell over the door, which usually sounded so cheerful, now sounded like a funeral toll as Officer Nolan pushed him out into the bright morning sunlight. The back of the patrol car smelled of stale sweat and cheap air freshener. It was a cramped, sterile cage of hard plastic. As the door slammed shut, sealing him inside, Marcus took a deep breath. The anger was there, a white-hot coal in his chest, but he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he channeled it. His mind, which was usually occupied with supply chain logistics, marketing strategies, and employee benefits, now became a legal fortress. He began documenting everything in his memory: the officer's name, the exact words used, the time on the clock, the faces of the witnesses in the diner. He was no longer just a victim. He was building his case. The drive to the station was short and silent. Nolan didn't say a word, focusing intently on the road, perhaps already feeling the first cold prickle of doubt about his actions. Or perhaps not. Marcus didn't know and didn't care. The officer was now just a variable in a much larger equation. At the station, he was led into a processing area that felt cold and impersonal. He was just another body to be booked, another file to be processed. The procedure was designed to strip a person of their identity. Empty your pockets, belt, shoelaces, watch. Each item removed felt like a small piece of his dignity being taken away. He was fingerprinted, the black ink staining the hands that had signed countless paychecks. The booking desk was manned by Sergeant Miller, a woman in her late 50s with tired but intelligent eyes. She had been on the force for 30 years and had developed a keen sense of when something wasn't right. As she went through the intake questions, she noted Marcus's calm demeanor, his articulate responses, and the complete lack of belligerence. It didn't fit the profile of a typical disorderly conduct arrest. Occupation, she asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. I'm a business owner, Marcus said. What kind of business? I own a chain of restaurants. Sergeant Miller paused, looking up from her screen. She glanced at the arresting officer's report, which listed the location of the arrest as the Morning Sun Diner. She looked back at Marcus. A long, silent moment passed as a connection began to form in her experienced mind. The Morning Sun Diner, she asked, her voice cautious. That's right, Marcus said. I own 9 of them. Sergeant Miller stopped typing. She picked up the report and read it again slowly. Then she looked at Officer Nolan, who was standing nearby trying to look busy. Something was very, very wrong here. Sergeant Miller set the paperwork down on her desk with a quiet finality. She had seen rookies make mistakes. She had seen hot-headed officers let their ego override their training. But this was different. This had the unmistakable stench of a career-ending, city-suing catastrophe. She looked at Marcus, who was sitting patiently in the processing area, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating a kind of powerful calm. Then she looked at Nolan, who was now actively avoiding her gaze. Nolan, she said, her voice low, but carrying the weight of 3 decades of authority. Stay here. But without another word, she stood up and walked directly to the office of her watch commander, Lieutenant Davies. Davies was a 25-year veteran of the force, a man who thought he had seen it all. He was working through a mountain of paperwork when Sergeant Miller walked in and closed the door behind her. We have a problem, Lieutenant, she said, placing Nolan's arrest report on his desk. Davies sighed, leaning back in his chair. What is it this time? Nolan get into another shouting match over a parking ticket? Worse, Miller said. He arrested a man for trespassing and disorderly conduct at the Morning Sun Diner on Trade Street. Okay, Davies said, waiting for the punchline. The man he arrested is Marcus Thorne. The name didn't immediately register. Davies looked at her blankly. And Marcus Thorne is... He's the man who owns the Morning Sun Diner on Trade Street, Miller said, letting the words hang in the air. And the other 8 locations. He's one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in this city. Nolan arrested him for trespassing in his own restaurant while he was eating breakfast. The color drained from Lieutenant Davies' face. He sat bolt upright, grabbing the report and reading it with a growing sense of dread. The flimsy probable cause, the nonsensical charges, it was all there in black and white. He dropped the report on his desk as if it were on fire. Where is he? In processing. Davies was on his feet in an instant. He walked briskly out of his office with Miller following a step behind. He went straight to the processing area and saw Marcus Thorne sitting exactly as Miller had described. He was not a man who looked like he belonged in police custody. Davies was a good cop who had come up the hard way, and he knew a monumental screw-up when he saw one. He walked back to his office, closed the door, and made a phone call to the assistant chief. The conversation was short, brutal, and filled with language not suitable for repeating. When he hung up, he looked as if he had aged 10 years. He walked back out to the processing area with one mission: damage control. Lieutenant Davies approached Marcus with a look of profound regret on his face. Mr. Thorne, he began, his voice heavy. I am Lieutenant Davies. On behalf of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, I want to offer you my deepest and most sincere apologies. There has been a terrible mistake. He personally unlocked the holding cell and held the door open. You are, of course, free to go. All charges are being dropped immediately. Marcus stood up and walked out, his movements measured. He was not interested in apologies. He was interested in accountability. A mistake, he said, his voice cold. That's what you call it. Your officer saw a black man and assumed he was a criminal. He refused to listen to reason, refused to believe I could possibly be the owner, and arrested me in my own place of business. That's not a mistake, Lieutenant. That's bigotry with a badge and a gun. Davies could only nod. You're right, sir. It's inexcusable. I want copies of everything. Marcus demanded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. The initial 911 call transcript, Officer Nolan's full incident report, the booking sheet, and every second of body camera and dash camera footage related to this incident. I want it all. We will get that for you immediately, Mr. Thorne, Davies said, already motioning for Sergeant Miller to begin the process. Good, Marcus said as his personal belongings were returned to him. He put his watch back on his wrist, a symbol of the time that had been stolen from him. The moment he stepped out of the police station and into the free air, he pulled out his phone. He didn't call his wife or his kids. Not yet. His first call was to Jonathan Reed, the most formidable civil rights attorney in the state. John, Marcus said as soon as the lawyer answered. It's Marcus. We have a situation. By the next morning, the situation had escalated into a full-blown legal assault. A federal lawsuit was filed seeking $6.2 million in damages from Officer Nolan individually and the city of Charlotte. The 30-page document was a masterclass in legal precision, alleging unlawful arrest, malicious prosecution, racial profiling, and the violation of Marcus's First, Fourth, and 14th Amendment rights. The lawsuit didn't just tell a story. It laid out a pattern arguing that Officer Nolan's actions were not an isolated incident but a symptom of a deeper systemic problem within the police department. The news of the lawsuit filed by one of the city's most respected businessmen hit the city like a thunderclap. The battle had just begun. The lawsuit was the opening salvo. The viral video was the carpet bomb. The retired professor, true to his word, had sent the footage to his daughter, a journalist at a local news station. Within hours, the video of a calm, well-dressed Marcus Thorne being handcuffed and led out of his own diner over a plate of pancakes was the lead story on every news channel in the state. By nightfall, it was a national headline. The hashtag #PancakesNotProbableCause began trending on social media. The court of public opinion was in session, and the verdict was swift and unanimous. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department was caught in a firestorm of its own making. The police chief held a press conference promising a full and thorough internal investigation. It was too little too late. The video evidence was irrefutable. It showed Nolan's aggression, his refusal to listen to the staff, and Marcus's unwavering composure. It was a textbook example of an abuse of power. The internal affairs investigation was swift and brutal. They pulled every piece of data on Officer Nolan's 4-year career. A disturbing pattern emerged. His traffic stops showed a stark racial disparity targeting Black and Hispanic drivers at a rate nearly 3 times that of his peers. He had a history of citizen complaints alleging rude and aggressive behavior, most of which had been dismissed with a simple warning. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a ticking time bomb that the department had failed to defuse. The investigation into Marcus Thorne's arrest was the final undeniable proof. Faced with an airtight, high-profile federal lawsuit, and public outrage that was boiling over the city's hand was forced. The Police Civilian Review Board held an emergency hearing. After reviewing the video and the internal affairs report, their recommendation was unanimous. 6 weeks after he arrested Marcus Thorne, Officer Nolan received a letter of termination. The letter cited gross misconduct violation of department policy and conduct unbecoming of an officer. His union filed a grievance but quietly dropped it a week later after their own lawyers reviewed the case and told him he had no chance. His career in law enforcement was over. At 29 years old, David Nolan had become a poster child for everything wrong with modern policing. His termination was a necessary consequence, but for Marcus Thorne, it was only the beginning of the fight for real justice. One officer's career was a small price to pay. The system that produced him was the real target. The city's attorneys knew they couldn't win. The evidence was too strong, the plaintiff too credible, and the public sentiment too hostile. Taking the case to trial would be a long, embarrassing, and incredibly costly spectacle that they would almost certainly lose. 9 months after the incident, they settled. While the exact figure was bound by a confidentiality agreement, sources close to the negotiation confirmed it was a multi-million-dollar settlement, a clear admission of guilt on the city's part. But for Marcus, the money was never the point. He called a press conference not in a stuffy law office but in the very diner where he had been arrested. The room was packed with reporters, but he also invited his staff, his loyal customers, and community leaders. He stood at a podium set up near the booth where he had been sitting that fateful morning. 9 months ago, in this very spot, I was arrested for trespassing while eating breakfast. He began, his voice ringing with quiet authority. Today, the city has acknowledged the injustice that was done to me, but this was never about me. It was about the principle that no one in this country should be judged as suspicious based on the color of their skin. He then made an announcement that stunned the room. I will not be keeping a single dime of the settlement money, he declared. Instead, I am using the entire sum to establish the Morning Sun Foundation for Justice and Entrepreneurship. This foundation will have 2 missions to provide legal resources for victims of racial profiling and police misconduct, and to provide grants and mentorship for minority entrepreneurs who are working to build their own dreams just as I did. The impact of Marcus's stand rippled outward. Spurred by the public outcry and the threat of a full-scale investigation by the Department of Justice, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department entered into a consent decree agreeing to sweeping reforms. They instituted mandatory, continuous implicit bias and de-escalation training. They implemented a data-driven early warning system to flag officers with problematic records like Nolan's, and most significantly, they agreed to the formation of a new empowered civilian oversight board with the authority to independently investigate misconduct and recommend disciplinary action. Marcus Thorne's 2-hour ordeal had forced a decade's worth of change. The morning sun streams through the large front window of the diner just as it always has. Marcus Thorne sits in his usual booth, a plate of perfect blueberry pancakes in front of him. The diner is bustling, the sounds of clinking silverware and happy conversation once again the familiar soundtrack to his life. But something has changed. The peace he feels now is not the easy peace of before, but a peace that has been fought for and won. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about rewriting the rules for everyone who would come after him. He takes a bite of the pancakes. They taste of defiance, of resilience, of victory. The path to justice is long, and the work is never truly finished, but for today, in this diner built on dreams, it feels like a new day is dawning. What does true justice look like to you? Is it a settlement? Check, a police officer getting fired, or does it require changing the entire system? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.
You're refusing a lawful search. Turn around, hands behind your back.
We're homeowners on our own property. You have no probable cause.
Your attitude just gave me all the cause I need.
Then say it clearly on camera. You're arresting us for asserting our constitutional rights.
Easy, Sarah. Hands back, sir. Now.
The sun-drenched Saturday afternoon was supposed to be a symbol of a dream fulfilled. The air in the quiet, tree-lined suburban neighborhood smelled of freshly cut grass and the promise of a peaceful life. For Robert Jackson, a 56-year-old structural engineer with calloused hands and a mind that saw the world in angles and load-bearing capacities, this was it. This was the culmination of 30 years of hard work, of saving, of planning. He and his wife, Dr. Sarah Jackson, a 54-year-old university historian who could trace the roots of injustice through centuries of documents, had just closed on their forever home. The moving truck had left the day before, and now they were unloading the last of their personal items from their new, slightly used cargo van. It was a moment of quiet triumph. Robert lifted a heavy box labeled University Press Research, passing it to Sarah. He saw the sweat on her brow and the smile on her face, and his heart swelled. They weren't just moving boxes. They were moving a life, a shared history into these new walls. But before we get into the heart of what happened next, an event that would shatter their peace and send shockwaves through the federal government, I need you to do something for me. Pause for a moment and drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever felt like you were being judged unfairly based on your appearance? A simple yes or no. And if you believe that no citizen should have to prove their right to exist in their own neighborhood, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened to the Jacksons is a story that every American needs to hear. As Robert turned back to the van, the serene afternoon was shattered by the screech of tires. Two dark, unmarked sedans swerved to the curb, boxing their van in. Doors flew open, and 4 men in tactical vests emblazoned with the bold letters ICE emerged. 2 of them, younger and more aggressive, strode towards the Jacksons. Their hands were resting on their sidearms, a posture of immediate intimidation. The lead agent, a man in his mid-30s with a hard-set jaw and eyes that seemed to be searching for a fight, spoke first. His voice cut through the suburban quiet like a blade. "Step away from the van. Put your hands where I can see them." Robert and Sarah exchanged a look of utter confusion. They complied, Robert setting down a box of antique books. "Is there a problem, officers?" Robert asked, his voice calm and steady, the voice of a man used to solving problems, not causing them. The lead agent, whose name they would later learn was Evans, ignored the question. "What are you doing here?" "Whose van is this?" he demanded. Sarah, a woman who had lectured on the Constitution to halls of university students, stepped forward slightly. "This is our van, and this is our new home," she said, gesturing to the house behind them. "We're unloading our belongings. We just moved in." Agent Evans sneered. "Agent Evans, we got a call," he said vaguely. "Suspicious activity. A van like this, people moving things in and out quickly. We need to see some identification. Now." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. "You don't belong here." Robert's mind, trained to see stress points and structural flaws, immediately identified the flaw in the agent's logic. "Officer," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "what specific suspicious activity was reported? Were homeowners moving our personal property in broad daylight?" Sarah continued the thought, her historian's precision coming to the forefront. "And on what grounds are you detaining us? You've blocked our vehicle and are demanding our papers. That constitutes a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. To do that, you need reasonable, articulable suspicion of a crime." The two agents exchanged a look. The younger one, Miller, seemed uncertain, but Evans's expression hardened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not with legal terminology. He saw it not as a citizen exercising their rights, but as a challenge to his authority. "Ma'am, I'm not here for a law lecture. I'm here because we have a job to do. Now I need to see your IDs." The confrontation was drawing attention. A neighbor across the street, Mr. Henderson, had been watering his prize-winning roses. He lowered his hose, his brow furrowed. Another neighbor, a young woman 2 doors down, discreetly pulled out her phone and began recording from her living room window. The suburban stage was set, and the players were locked in a dangerous standoff not of weapons, but of rights versus perceived authority. Robert, sensing the escalation, decided to comply, but under protest. "We will show you our identification," he said, moving slowly. "But I want it on the record that we are doing so under duress, and we do not consent to this detention. My wallet is in my back pocket." As Robert reached for his wallet, Agent Evans tensed. "Slowly!" He barked, his hand tightening on his weapon. The beautiful Saturday afternoon now felt charged, dangerous, and irrevocably broken. The dream was turning into a nightmare. Robert slowly produced his wallet and handed his driver's license to Agent Evans. Sarah did the same. Evans snatched them, his eyes scanning the cards with a cynical disbelief. The addresses were local, but not for this specific affluent street. Of course, they hadn't had time to update them yet. The closing was just 48 hours ago. "These addresses aren't for this house," Evans stated, as if he'd uncovered a major deception. "As we said, we just moved in," Sarah explained patiently. "The paperwork is in the house. The deed, the closing documents. The van is registered to us. You can check." But Evans wasn't interested in de-escalation. In his mind, the questioning of his authority had already branded the Jacksons as uncooperative. He turned to his partner. "Miller, run these." Miller took the licenses and walked back to their sedan, leaving Evans to stand guard over the two middle-aged professionals. For several long minutes, they stood in silence, the subjects of a federal investigation on their own front lawn. Robert's mind was racing, calculating the potential outcomes, the legal ramifications. Sarah was doing the same, running through case law from Terry versus Ohio to more recent precedents on racial profiling. She knew they were in the right, but she also knew that being right was no guarantee of safety when dealing with an officer determined to prove a point. Mr. Henderson had now turned off his hose and was watching intently from his porch. The young woman's phone remained pointed in their direction. The silent audience was growing. What do you think is the most important right a citizen has when interacting with law enforcement? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Miller returned from the car, a tablet in his hand. He spoke to Evans in a low voice, but Sarah's sharp hearing caught the key phrases. "Clean, no warrants. He's an engineer. She's a professor." The information should have ended the encounter. It was exculpatory. It proved they were exactly who they said they were, law-abiding citizens. Miller looked at Evans, expecting the senior agent to hand back the licenses and leave. But Evans had invested too much ego in this stop. Backing down now in front of the neighbors would feel like a defeat. So he doubled down. He walked back to Robert and Sarah. "I'm going to need to take a look inside your van," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. Sarah's response was immediate and clear. "On what grounds, officer, you have our identification? It's clean. You have no probable cause to believe a crime has been committed. Therefore, you have no legal basis for a search. We do not consent." She wasn't argumentative. She was stating facts. But to Agent Evans, these facts were an attack. His face flushed with anger. "Ma'am, your lack of cooperation is giving me probable cause." It was a rookie mistake, a fundamental misunderstanding of the Fourth Amendment that a first-year law student could dismantle. And a woman who had taught constitutional history for 2 decades certainly could. "No, officer, it absolutely does not," Sarah stated, her voice unwavering. "Asserting our constitutional rights is not in itself a suspicious act. The Supreme Court has been abundantly clear on that point. You cannot use our refusal to consent as the basis for a search. That is circular logic, and it is illegal." The parking lot seemed to fall silent. Evans was trapped. He had no facts, only a flimsy, prejudiced tip and his own escalating anger. He looked from Sarah's determined face to Robert's stoic expression, then glanced at the neighbor recording on her phone. He had been publicly corrected, his authority questioned, and his legal ignorance exposed. For a man like Evans, this was an intolerable humiliation. And in that moment, he made a decision that would not only ruin his career, but would also cost the U.S. government millions of dollars. He decided to assert his power in the only way he had left. "That's it," he said, his voice tight with fury. "You're interfering with a federal investigation. Turn around. Place your hands behind your backs. You're both under arrest." Robert and Sarah stared at him, stunned into silence for the first time. Arrest for what? For unloading their own van, for knowing their own rights. "You have to be kidding me," Robert said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. Evans pulled out his handcuffs. "Does it look like I'm kidding?" The cold, hard click of the metal ratcheting shut around Sarah's wrists was the loudest sound on the quiet street. Then another click as Robert's hands were bound. The historian and the engineer handcuffed on their own property, arrested for the crime of moving while black. The neighbor's camera kept rolling, capturing every shameful second. The ride to the Federal Processing Center was silent and surreal. Robert and Sarah sat in the back of the sedan, the hard plastic seats a stark contrast to the leather of their own car. The air was thick with the smell of cheap air freshener and an undercurrent of injustice. Agent Evans drove his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Miller sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, refusing to make eye contact. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. They arrived at a nondescript federal building and were escorted inside past agents who gave them cursory, indifferent glances. They were just 2 more bodies in the system. They were taken to a processing area where a supervising officer, a man named Henderson, a bitter irony sharing a name with their watchful neighbor, was on duty. Supervisor Henderson was a 25-year veteran with tired eyes that had seen it all. He looked up from his paperwork as Evans brought the Jacksons in. "What have we got, Evans?" he asked, his voice weary. "Interfering with a federal investigation," Evans announced with a hint of pride. Henderson looked at the well-dressed, middle-aged black couple in handcuffs. They didn't fit the usual profile. "Interfering with what investigation?" "Suspicious activity, potential smuggling." They were uncooperative, refused a search of their vehicle. Henderson sighed. This was already sounding thin. He began the standard booking procedure, starting with their belongings. He took Robert's wallet first, cataloging its contents. Then he took Sarah's purse. He pulled out her wallet, and inside, nestled next to her driver's license, was her university faculty ID, complete with her photo entitled Dr. Sarah Jackson, Professor of American History. He paused. He looked at the ID, then at Sarah, then back at the ID. He picked up Robert's wallet again and found his professional engineering license and his corporate ID for a major national firm. He held up the 2 pieces of identification. "Evans," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Did you verify any of this?" They were belligerent. Evans insisted, his bravado starting to crack under Henderson's steady gaze. Henderson ignored him. He picked up his desk phone and made a call to the university's history department. The conversation was brief. He hung up and stared at Evans. "I just confirmed," Henderson said, his voice barely a whisper, "that we have just arrested Dr. Sarah Jackson. She literally wrote a textbook on the Fourth Amendment that is used by 3 different law schools in this state." The blood drained from Agent Evans's face. Supervisor Henderson stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. He walked over to the Jacksons. "My deepest apologies," he said, his voice filled with a gravity that had been absent before. "There has been a terrible mistake." He personally unlocked their handcuffs. He then turned to Evans and Miller. "My office. Now." The door to Henderson's office shut, but his furious, muffled voice could be heard through the glass. Within minutes, the regional director was on the phone. Within an hour, an assistant U.S. attorney was on site, looking pale and deeply concerned. The Jacksons were not questioned. They were offered coffee water and profuse apologies. Sarah, composed and clear-headed, made their demands. "We want copies of everything," she stated. "The initial tip, all radio traffic dash cam footage, your body cam footage, the arrest report, and Officer Evans's written statement of probable cause. We want it all, and we want it tonight." There was no argument. The federal apparatus, so clumsy and brutal in its initial action, was now scrambling to mitigate a disaster of its own making. The Jacksons were released just under 4 hours after their arrest. As they stepped out of the federal building and into the evening air, the sun had set on their dream day. But a new day was dawning, a day of reckoning. The first call they made was to one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country. By Monday morning, the video from their neighbor's window had been sent to a national news outlet. By Tuesday, ICE arrests professor for unloading van was the top headline across the country. The video was everywhere, a stark, undeniable visual of government overreach. The lawsuit was filed a week later. It was a masterpiece of legal argumentation detailing every constitutional violation with chilling precision. It alleged unlawful detention, false arrest, malicious prosecution, and racial profiling in violation of the 4th and 14th Amendments. It named Agent Evans and Agent Miller individually, and it named the United States government as the defendant. The story exploded, igniting a national firestorm over racial profiling and the accountability of federal agents. The lawsuit set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. The Department of Justice opened an immediate and aggressive internal investigation. They pulled Agent Evans's and Agent Miller's files. The findings were staggering. Over a 5-year period, Agent Evans had initiated stops and searches of Black and Latino citizens at a rate nearly 4 times that of his peers. His arrest record showed a clear pattern of charging individuals with interference or resisting when his initial suspicions proved baseless, a classic tactic to cover up a bad stop. Agent Miller had been his partner for 18 months and had never filed a single complaint. The suspicious tip that started the whole ordeal was traced back to a call from a known local agitator with a history of making racially biased 911 calls. The entire foundation of the stop was rotten from the start. Agent Evans and Agent Miller were fired within a month, their careers in federal law enforcement over. But the Jacksons and their legal team pushed for more than just 2 terminations. They wanted systemic change. They argued in court that this wasn't about 1 or 2 bad apples, but about a poisoned tree, a culture that allowed and even encouraged such biased policing. The case never made it to a jury. Faced with the irrefutable video evidence and the damning internal investigation, the government's attorneys knew they had no defense. They entered into settlement negotiations. The Jacksons were not interested in a quick payday. They wanted accountability that would be felt across the entire agency. 9 months after that sunny Saturday was turned into a nightmare, a federal judge signed off on the settlement. The United States government would pay the Jackson family $5.9 million. It was one of the largest settlements of its kind in U.S. history. In her only public statement delivered on the courthouse steps, Dr. Sarah Jackson was clear. This was never about the money, she said, her husband Robert standing steadfast by her side. This was about ensuring that what happened to us never happens to anyone else. It was about forcing a system that operates in the shadows to be dragged into the light. The story of the Jacksons became a turning point. Their case, Jackson versus United States, became required reading in law enforcement academies nationwide. The video of their arrest was used as a definitive training tool on what not to do. A powerful illustration of how bias and ego can lead to catastrophic constitutional violations. As for the settlement, the Jacksons stayed true to their word. They used the majority of the $5.9 million to establish the Jackson Foundation for Civil Rights and Accountability. The Foundation's mission is twofold: to provide funding for legal aid to victims of police misconduct and to support educational programs that teach citizens, especially young people, about their constitutional rights. David Evans never worked in law enforcement again. He was disgraced a poster child for profiling and abuse of power. The reforms forced upon the agency as part of the settlement, including enhanced bias training, a robust early warning system for problematic agents, and stricter criteria for what constitutes reasonable suspicion, began to slowly change the culture of the department. Robert and Sarah Jackson still live in their forever home. The memory of that day has not faded, but it no longer defines them. They continue their work, he as an engineer, she as a historian. But now they have another title: advocates. They proved that two citizens armed with knowledge and courage could stand up to the full force of their government and not only win, but force it to be better. The quiet of their suburban street returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a peace that had been fought for, a tranquility earned through a trial by fire. Sometimes when Robert is out in the yard, his neighbor Mr. Henderson will give him a nod of deep respect. The community that had witnessed their humiliation now saw them as symbols of strength. The Jackson story is a powerful reminder that the rights we hold dear are not self-enforcing. They exist only because people are willing to stand up for them, to challenge injustice, even when it is inconvenient and frightening. Their experience shows that even in the face of systemic bias, accountability is possible. It is a long and difficult road, but it is a necessary one. What is your single biggest takeaway from the Jacksons' ordeal? And what do you believe is the most effective way to ensure law enforcement accountability in our communities? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters in this conversation. And if stories like this, stories of justice and the fight for civil rights, are important to you, please subscribe and support our channel.